The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Kia ora, it's Duncan Greive here, host of The Fold. I'm taking a few weeks off to rest and recover and kind of just get away from thinking about the media over the next few weeks. So what we're going to do is run reissues of some of our favorite episodes from throughout the year. We'll be back in late January, but in the meantime, enjoy and have a great summer. Nau mai, hoki mai, kia The Fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Glenn McDonald, who had a job title. It's a buzzy job title that he's the only person on earth who's ever had it. It existed. It was made for him. It was imported with him. And when he left the company, that was the end of it. That job title was Data Alchemist at Spotify. And he worked there for over a decade. And if you think about how old Spotify is, how old music streaming is, that means that that's a long, long time. And the title tells you really what the job was. He basically could look at, had access to all of the monumental volume of data about music kind of consumption that Spotify created, and he could bend it, shape it, test it, make things with it. That was his license, and that's just a crazy job. And he's done a bunch of things in his life. He came to Spotify after his startup that he worked at called Echo Nest was acquired by Spotify to basically build out their recommendations algorithms. So whether you love or hate or are ambivalent about the way that Spotify serves you music after the end of a playlist or when you put on an artist radio, Glenn McDonald had a pretty decent role in figuring that out. He also had a massive role, which is quite behind the scenes, in figuring out a kind of a taxonomy of music, a list of all the different sort of micro genres that make it up, which he catalogued on a site called Every Noise at Once, which has got up to sort of something like 6,500 genres now, and is quite an amazing achievement on its own. But he's an incredibly cerebral guy. He's down here to speak at the Going Global Music Summit, which is an event put on it's a very much a music industry facing event in New Zealand that is just trying to help our artists, managers, labels understand how to go from here to the world. So he's an incredibly credentialed person to be doing that. And I'm interviewing him on stage about that tomorrow as I record this. But the other thing that he's done lately, he left Spotify last year and has written a book called You've Not Heard Your Favorite Song Yet. And it's essentially an attempt to kind of take everything he's learned while at Spotify and a lot of the sort of arguments about and against music streaming more broadly across a whole bunch of dimensions, and explain from the interior what that looks like. And he's a real streaming positivist, but not naively so. It's like a phenomenally intelligent person, and he can back up his positions with the world's greatest ever music data set as far as listenership goes. As someone who, their first cultural love was music, who, spent all of their money on records and CDs and music magazines, and ultimately wrote for and edited music magazines. This was a really rare and special opportunity for me. I really loved talking to Glenn, even as he was just disproving a lot of things which I sort of thought to be true. So, yeah, whether you're into music or not, I think this is a really fun, really fascinating episode about what happens when a culture becomes digitized. And so listen on. This is Glenn McDonald, former data alchemist of Spotify, on The Fold. Kia ora, Glenn. Welcome to The Fold.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I wondered if you could start by telling our listeners who you are and how you describe the job you did, the very interesting job that you did for Spotify for so long.
Sure. So I'm Glenn, and I worked for a music intelligence startup called the Echo Nest, and we were doing music recommendations and categorization and stuff for these new things called streaming services in 2011, and trying to get customers. And so my job became like doing things that would get us attention, just anything that was interesting.
Yeah, that was marketing.
Well, I mean, yeah, it was all about awareness, because that was what made our business. And we were trying to get Spotify as a customer, and we were meanwhile powering some of their competitors, and there was sort of a race between the money to buy us and the internal capabilities at Spotify, and the money won. So we got acquired. So then I spent 10 years at Spotify, and there was actually a job title in the Spotify HR system called Data Alchemist. There was only me. In theory, there could have been others, but there never actually were. And it was my official responsibility was to experiment with what it was possible to make out of all that listening data. 600 million people listening to music a few hours a day. It's a lot of interesting data. And in theory, I would prototype things and hand them over to real engineering teams to like make features out of them. But real engineering teams are usually booked 6 months in advance, and technology is such that you could do a lot of stuff just yourself if you're stubborn, and I'm very stubborn. So I ended up running a lot of things too, in addition to my nominal experimenter role.
I wonder if you could kind of cast your mind back to that period where you were acquired and describe the sort of culture of Spotify that you arrived into. Because, you know, it was then and kind of remains now to it, in some ways, like a fairly singular big tech company that comes from Europe as opposed to the US. But also, while it feels like it's sort of one audio, you can debate the extent to which that's true now, it certainly wasn't clear that would happen at the time. So you give us a bit of a sense of what those early years were like within Spotify.
Well, so Spotify had basically begun sort of as a product, as a search box. It was a big library in the cloud. You search for what you want, and you hit play. Like, that was how it began. And over time, they began realizing that there needed to be a little bit more to it than that for it to be compelling and sustainable. So acquiring the Echo Nest was the big step in the direction of using algorithms to help personalize and program. And at the same time, they acquired this editorial playlisting company called Tunigo, and that was the corresponding step into editorial programming. So when we got there, it was really at the beginning of the sort of now what stage of a company's existence. Like they'd sort of accomplished the original goal of, you can find a song and play it almost instantly. It solved the latency problems in the network infrastructure. And then it was like, well, it's one thing to have all that music waiting out there, but how do you know to type the name of some song you've never heard? So both the algorithms and the editors were sort of beginnings of an attempt to answer that question. Like, how do we expose people to music they don't already know from CDs in a cardboard box in their basement? And the thing I always said was amazing about the Echo Nest, which was a small startup before we were acquired, was we understood that music was the only reason we existed. Like, we had to do a good job with music recommendations. Otherwise, we might as well just give up. Like there's just no point. So when my first day at the Echo Nest, I showed up and they're like, "Oh, Glenn, you're here. We're putting Mickey Mouse cartoon noises on the Franz Liszt classical music station that we're trying to impress this potential customer Spotify with. Please find out why and make it stop."
That's a problem.
But everybody understood that was a problem. Like it didn't matter what the answer was. It didn't matter if it was expensive or cheap. It was like, if we're going to put cartoon noises on a classical station, then we should just go get barista jobs or something. There's no point. And certainly at the beginning, we were first acquired at Spotify. That was pretty widely true at Spotify too. Like I didn't have to argue with people about what music was or whether it was important or not. Like we were a music streaming company. We had to do music streaming right. Over the years, Spotify got bigger, expanded into other forms of audio, and business-wise, the ambitions were much broader. So over time, yeah, sometimes I did have to get into those arguments that I didn't want to and explain, no, really, reggae and metal are different. If we put a reggae song in a metal playlist, that's bad.
I want to get into some of that sort of latter stage evolution of Spotify stuff in a bit, but there's a project that you ran alongside it that feels sort of related to, but also distinct from your work for Spotify, called Every Noise at Once. And I've been sort of playing with it a bit in preparation for this. And, I want to ask sort of two questions about it. But first, could you just sort of explain what it is and why you made it? And then, I guess, suppose, how it relates to your work for Spotify.
Sure. I'll go in the other direction because it's easier to understand. So one of the things that I was in charge of at Spotify was the genre taxonomy. And that within the Spotify app doesn't show up very much. You see it at the end of the year in Wrapped. But behind the scenes, it powers a lot of analytics and tracking and feeds into some kinds of recommendations, and artists care about it. And there's a bunch of other things it's used for. But I thought it was interesting on its own. And so the Every Noise at Once, which has the front page of it at everynoise.com, is a giant map of all those genres. And it was a giant map when I started, and there were only 400, I think, the first time I put it up. And when we got to 800, I thought, maybe there are 1,000 genres after all. And after 2,000, I'm like, all right, it no longer matters. Like, we're just trying to find all the communities of musical interest in the world, and they keep coming into existence. So maybe we'll never be done. But the goal for me of the website was to not only let people explore, but encourage them to explore. So there's no login, there's no personalization, it doesn't know who you are, and so it can't patronize you. It can't try to feed you what it thinks you want. All it can do is report on what the world knows about music as instantiated in their listening.
And that's what I found so kind of beguiling about it. Within a few scrolls, I was listening to Russian Rave, which I didn't know existed, didn't necessarily expect to like, found quite compelling. That sense of serendipitous discovery of music, which, whether it's through radio or record stores, felt like it was quite a big, or magazines, just where I come from, was quite a big part of the previous mode of music consumption and discovery. The theory of Spotify should allow for it, but the practical element, I find it, I don't know if you read, Kyle Chaker wrote a story that sort of recently essentially denouncing the current or sort of shape of Spotify as a user product, which I'd be interested to get your perspective on. But it seems to me that over time it has progressively narrowed its assumptions about what you as a listener want. A, do you think that's fair? And B, if it is, why has that happened? Because that's a reasonably commonly held thesis amongst hardcore music people, as far as I understand it.
I think I might slightly rephrase it. I don't know that it's narrowed its focus so much that it was always narrow and it's just gotten better at it.
Okay.
Like I don't. It's not like there's a lot of like widely exploratory features in Spotify that they've removed. It's just
sure
everything that is personalized has just been refined towards the goal of keeping you listening. And that, I think it would have, that was the goal to begin with. Like that's the philosophical goal of all that personalization stuff at Spotify, is basically control the listening audience so that you can program whatever you want to them. And the theory is that if you're being satisfied with every new song and it feels familiar, that you will listen longer and you'll be less likely to stop paying. But for me, curiosity is a huge part of the experience of music, food, culture, just anything. No matter how many, I love burritos. I eat a lot of burritos. I eat a lot of just the same burritos. I know what they're going to taste like. I'm not exploring culture further in that moment. But then I go and try things that I don't know. And that mode of exploration by its nature, has to be active. You can't have exploration delivered to you. It doesn't. It's like getting on a cruise ship and having someone point at a city along the shore and say, "Well, that's Switzerland," or whatever. Like, that's not exploring. You're not making decisions.
But within Spotify, I guess it increasingly feels like satisfying the mission of lean back, more radio-type listening, which I assume to be, and you talk a lot about this in the book, about a kind of a more common behavior than the sort of music geeky kind of, I want to find something new. What's the most efficient or entertaining or exciting way to kind of go on a journey? That it hasn't developed that side as well as it has developed the, like, I'm just going to play music, whether it's familiar or unfamiliar. It's just unfamiliar enough to kind of keep you going. Like, while you were there, were these kind of conscious conversations, and was there ever an attempt to sort of have a more and kind of raise the profile of a more exploratory side of Spotify? Or is that something that just kind of inherently has to happen in different ways and through different channels, and there's too much expectation of it all happening within a single app?
I think it can all happen within an app, and I think there's several good Spotify features that are useful for that. The fans also like List, where you can sort of navigate through the world of artists and how audiences associate them with each other, is good for that. The Discovered On list, where you can see the playlists that people are discovering each artist on, playlists made mostly by just other Spotify users. Those are super powerful. I think the pragmatic business reality is the people who are willing to put effort into exploring are going to do it regardless. So you kind of don't have to cater to them or give them good features, because if you don't, they'll do it anyway. Whereas the people who want a seamless lean back experience are not going to make it for themselves, because that's the whole point. So most of the effort goes into that because they're the rewards. There's the thing where you can do something for a user who wants a way of listening that they are not going to make for themselves, or if they do, it's going to be much more constrained. So, I mean, as much as it's true that most Spotify algorithmic things feed people the kind of thing they already know, you get exposed to a lot more music that way than if you just, listen to the Counting Crows album that you loved when you were 18 over and over again. And so it's a little bit of a win in terms of diversity.
Is it fair to say that you're a streaming optimist? Like, you're a believer that this has been a good thing for music and particularly for music listeners?
Yes. I mean, I'd go further and say that to me, bringing all the world's music online is like the single greatest cultural achievement of my lifetime. Like, it's astonishing to me. I mean, obviously it doesn't work without the internet, so it kind of doesn't make sense to say that like music is the biggest thing if it couldn't exist without all these wires. But yet I believe it anyway, even if it doesn't totally make sense. And the book is organized into a sort of inventory of fears people have about streaming, some of which are unreasonable. They're all reasonable, but some of them are wrong. And some of them are more right than people know. And then a section about some of the joys that streaming music and collective knowledge make possible. And I don't purport to score them and like add them up. And you could read the fears chapter and be like, well, these are all the things I care about, and I don't care about any of the things that you think are cool, and thus streaming is bad by your same evidence. So I'm not trying to make up people's minds for them, but definitely my mind is, it's vastly positive. We're still at the beginning of figuring out how to fulfill its potential for music, for humanity, for everything. But yeah, big thumbs up. If I'm reduced to one direction of thumb, it's definitely up.
And I sort of have, I don't know, I guess I'm probably like I feel like I'm a type, there's this person who grew up maybe in the 80s or 90s, has a big record collection, read a bunch of music magazines, was used to it, like, a bunch of us would have used to work at record stores, and it felt like, whether this was accurate or not, it felt like there was some kind of functioning music economy in that era that worked for artists at different scales. And again, like, all this stuff is perception, right? And a lot of us don't have data to back it up. It doesn't feel like it's still functioning to the same extent now. Now, a lot of things in the outside world do, and music is unavoidably part of it. But I'll sort of give you a complaint that I've read and heard from artists a fair amount, and kind of get you to sort of respond to that.
Sure.
That, essentially that it's been a fantastic thing for audiences, all the world's music, $12 a month. But for artists, it's made music into just another form of user-generated content where only a relatively small fraction can, from the making of recorded music, make a living in a way that didn't used to sort of operate that way. I'm sure you've heard that argument a trillion times.
Yes, I have.
What do you say? So,
I mean, when I was early on after we got acquired, I had to sort of answer this for myself. Like, am I part of the evil empire or what? And it's really, really hard to answer that question if you start from an individual artist's change in fortunes, or new fortunes if they weren't around before. Because that's all anecdotal, and there's like lots of reasons why an individual artist might become huge or become small again. So I started from, all right, let's look at the whole business. And the IFPI, the RIAA in the US has a great online database that you can look at that charts total revenue of the US recorded music industry by format from, 1970 or something.
It's an amazing piece of data visualization.
And what you could see from it as early, when I started looking in 2014 or something, was that basically the simple version is CDs were a golden era, in part because people rebought things they already had. So there was some of that was an artificial, it was not just a golden era of music, it was also a golden era of selling music.
Yeah.
And then downloads killed it. We could argue about whether that's true in a social sense, but in an economic sense, like, very clear. Downloads just tanked the whole music business. And streaming was beginning to build it up again. And if you followed that year over year since, streaming, especially if you don't hit the button that adjusts for inflation, then it looks great. It looks like we're back to basically the peak. If you adjust it for inflation, it's I don't know, 2/3 or 70% of what it was, but we've had fewer years in the streaming era than we had in the CD era. So it's still reasonable to think that we may get to streaming may take us to a point where the recorded music industry overall is larger than it was before. So that's sort of one level of, okay, we're not totally ruining human society by doing this. And on aggregate. Then we have to think about, all right, now is that money going to different people? Is it being distributed differently? And the thing I think people forget, and it's hard to argue about because we don't have data from 1989 in nearly the detail that we have it from 2019, but not very many people were making a living from recorded music in the 80s. And the label gatekeepers had a pretty firm grip on every bit of the economy, not only the actual distribution of the music, but every other surrounding bit of the economy that fed into that. You could make a meager living as a really good local artist who played a lot of gigs and made most of their money from shows and selling CDs at your shows. But that was a pretty small, that was just like round off air compared to the actual music business. So what I did at one point go through and like look at gold and platinum record certifications and the charts through the 80s and 90s and try to get a sense of what percentage of the music revenue was controlled by the top 100,000 artists, and then compare that to what we have in the streaming era. And what I found was, it's hard to tell, but almost certainly it's less now. The popularity pyramid is flatter. The top of the pyramid actually controls less of the money now in streaming than it did in the LP or CD eras. That doesn't help if you are a new unknown artist trying to make a living. And if you're comparing the living that you're not making with someone that you read about from 1984, and because the one you read about from 1984 is someone who got a major label deal. Like if there's the story that survived from that era, then it's almost by definition from the very top. Even when it seems like obscurity, it's the obscure end of the head of the pyramid. So I think it becomes a very complicated argument. And I think it's very interesting to talk about how that money gets distributed. How could it be distributed? How can you make a living as an artist? And what degree of responsibility the streaming platforms have to distribute, like to have a social agenda and not just an accounting role.
Let's get into that now, because that forms a second part of the sort of argument against streaming. One is that it because of the label's ownership stakes, that they sort of win twice, but ultimately that the revenue per stream is too low, and that somehow it's never particularly clear how, but you make it very clear, I think, in your book, that big artists get a disproportionate share of revenues that flow out of Spotify. And there's these arguments about user-centric or artist-centric or sort of pro rata divisions. But this one of the things these things have been repeated so many times they've almost become true in people's minds, that if you were to allocate like some indie artists' listenership by by the number of streams that happen, that somehow that they would get more money by a different way of allocating funds than the one that they currently have. You argue quite convincingly in the book that the kind of the reverse of that is true in some respects. Do you want to just talk, and I know that these things are complicated, and you wrote a whole chapter on it, and you could probably have done a whole book just on that, but just kind of top line what those three different approaches are, and and what really ends up happening to people's money with the current model?
Yeah, so the details are complicated, but the ideas are not. So the two methods that people usually talk about are pro rata, which is the one all streaming user services currently use, which says, take all the money you make in a month, take all the streams in a month, divide up the money by the streams. That's the principle. It's actually more complicated than that because it's not one big pool of money. It's a pool for every individual product. So like US Premium is separate from the Poland ad-supported users and everything. But
let's keep it so it's so simple.
But the basic idea is one big pool of all the money, one big accounting of all the streams, divide the money up by the streams. And the competing idea, which no one has ever implemented, is called user-centric. And the idea is instead of making one big pool, you distribute each user's money they contribute, whether by paying or by watching ads or listening to ads, to just the artists they listen to. And almost universally, the people arguing for that model argue for it because they believe it would help independent artists. And they believe that the pro rata method, because it's stream share and the most popular artists have the largest share of streams, it seems obvious that that must be, as you say, disproportionately benefiting the most popular artists. But because I worked at Spotify and just like we had all these streams were in a database, I could actually do the math for this whole system, including the complicated bits about Poland versus the US and whatever, and find out the answer. And so I did so every month and I just kept doing it for years. And it never changed. The answer was always the pro rata system that's currently in use is actually the most popular artists slightly subsidizing less popular artists. The exact opposite of what everyone who advocates for its removal believes is what they'd get. And I think once you stop and think about it, it makes sense. Because the way pro rata works is the most active listeners basically end up reallocating some of the money from the least active listeners. You can think about it as you pay your money in, you use up part of it by listening, and if there's any left over, then it goes to people who listen to a lot more than you. And what turns out to be the case, and I think it's not surprising if you just think about people, is the people who listen to less music tend to know less music and thus tend to listen to the most popular artists because it's all they know. Whereas the people who know obscure artists tend to be the more active listeners who listen to more. So what happens in the current pro rata scheme that people think they don't like is active fans of obscure music actually move the leftover money from less active fans of popular artists to those independent artists. So it's actually working for them now. And the really sad part is it's small either way. It's like 5 to 10% in general subsidy at the moment. And the user-centric model would be 5 to 10% worse for independent artists on the whole. Neither of those is enough to change anybody's ability to make a living. So it's interesting, and I thought it was interesting enough to spend a chapter on it in my book, but it doesn't help. Like if your concern is more people making a living from music who aren't already Taylor Swift and Ed Sheeran, then that chapter is just a distraction. It doesn't help you improve the world at all, sadly, as much as I liked writing it.
I did sense that, to be honest. So it felt like this kind of, an answer to like a decade's worth of complaints in some respect. On some level, even just listening to you talk then, part of what, like if you look at the total volume of music that's been released and the accessibility of creating a passable piece of music, along with the internet, that's kind of the biggest change, right? Like starting a band was expensive and annoying. Writing songs, recording it, and then getting it pressed. These were all barriers before you even started, whether you were self-releasing or trying to get signed, which kind of thinned the herd in quite a useful way. Whereas now those mechanisms, you and I with you can actually do this, and so can see our producer. But even an idiot like me, can probably, with an hour, using kind of accessible tools, create something that passes as a song. Terrible, no one listens to it. But I could, within not much more time than that, put it on Spotify. There is a vastly greater volume and much easier accessibility to people of different incomes and in different territories. And that is part of the issue. There's just more stuff for people to get into, more, whether it's micro genres, there's just more of everything. Firstly, is that thesis correct? And then, and secondly, sort of when did you start to notice it kind of, that shift from the kind of commodified, professionalized music industry that still basically existed at the start of Spotify to the much vaster and more sort of wild, in some respects, music, it's not even necessarily an industry, but sort of music release sphere that we have now?
Yeah, definitely one of the interesting things that all the streaming services and YouTube and TikTok and everything else do is bring amateur music, and I say this as someone, my songs are on Spotify. They're definitely songs. They're not great, but they're songs. You listen to them and go, all right, this guy's making mistakes, but I can tell there are notes he's trying to sing, right? That's a level. But my lifetime earnings, $4 in US dollars. So
you could almost buy a burrito with that down here.
Exchange rates would kill me. But yeah, it's weird in sort of a global historical sense that stuff exists in the same realm as Drake and Taylor, everybody else. And Daniel tried to use the football analogy at some time recently to explain this. Like, there's a lot of people who play organized football or soccer in the world. Most of them make no money from it. Most of them pay, buy their own uniforms, pay to have coaches and stuff. The thing that's really different about music is basically everyone plays in Wembley. There's one stadium. Spotify is the stadium. Everybody's there. Everybody's kicking the same ball in a sense. And so there's nothing technical that prevents my crazy songs from getting 1 billion streams. Like, I could be famous tomorrow. It's not going to happen. There's the fact that there's no technical barrier doesn't really make any difference, because the social barriers in the attention economy and the fact that my songs aren't very good are definitely going to prevent that from happening. But you can see the goal there. So as an aspiring musician, and I'm not an aspiring musician, it's maddening, because there you are. I mean, it's one thing if you couldn't get signed and thus you couldn't get a record pressed and thus your record wasn't in stores. But now none of that is keeping you. So there's nothing but the perverse and insistence of all the world's listeners in not listening to your song for yet another day that keeps you from being famous. So I think I think there's a large amount of the music economy that's playing on this aspiration too. Like, indie distributors, the one you put my music on, it's free and they take a cut of my royalties, which is a terrible business for them given my royalties. But DistroKid and TuneCore and 1RPM and all these things, their business is selling the dream that you could just sign up and basically upload your own stuff, sort of, and become famous. And this is the version of selling shovels to gold miners. Like, that, it's hard to make a living as an artist. It's easier to make a living as a computer programmer working for a company that sells services to musicians.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. And in some ways, it feels like it's not perfectly analogous, but it certainly has some of the same qualities about the sort of furies that the major labels used to get from some artists, and now are sort of starting to shift to the platforms. Maybe there's just a fundamental. It's really hard to be a successful artist. There's not that many slots, and they've always been hard to get.
But it is now possible to do without going through the major labels. And even just over the time I was at Spotify, looking at the data, you could see that the patterns were shifting. Major label dominance was slowly eroding. The number of artists making, any threshold you pick, the number of artists making that threshold was steadily going up over time. Not fast enough to produce an order of magnitude change in the people making a living from music in a year, but it's not. If we want that, we have to do something much more drastic. Like it's not you're not going to rearrange Spotify's revenue model or like tax Taylor Swift a little bit and suddenly multiply the number of people who can make a living from music by 10. You're going to have to change society a lot more fundamentally than that. But within the machinery that Spotify operates in and the existing power structures and major labels and all the other streaming services, it is having a slightly slow positive effect, if by positive you mean a distribution of access and power and less dominance by the top artists and the top companies.
Are there artists or, obviously going to be the case, but are there like particular stories of people who have taken this sort of seemingly insurmountable issue of you're just a tiny speck and you're playing Wembley against Taylor Swift kind of thing and have sort of figured out a way to kind of make it within that paradigm that feels like it's instructive or repeatable, and not just some weird cosmic series of events happened. Thinking about the global audience that we'll be speaking to tomorrow as we record this, everyone's going to want that juice.
Yes, and I think there's good news and bad news. And the bad news is there's no magic. There's no tweak you can do that's suddenly going to make all the algorithms work in your favor. All that stuff is a waste of time. And that's the good news is all the things that you always knew you should have done to make a music career before streaming, during streaming, after streaming, all those things still work. And those are the things you should actually do. So whenever people start asking me for tricks to game the algorithms, I say, no. The fact that you're asking me that question makes me fairly certain that you're wasting a lot of time thinking about this that you should be using on doing something more productive. And the things that make music happen, music culturally, because streaming hasn't really changed music culture that much, are all the same they always have been. They're mostly around building communities. And if you're Taylor Swift, you have a community of your own, with your fans. But for most artists, that community has to involve other artists. It has to involve scenes or genres or Discord servers or something that binds together a bunch of people who like a thing and a bunch of people who are making that thing in such a way that community sustains itself. And this was a thing I tell, just at the level of what do I do so that my new releases, pop on Spotify? Like, well, you have to be part of, there's two answers. One is you're on social media every day. And if that's the kind of person you are, then you're probably already doing that. And if you're good at it, great. That's a way to maintain an audience. But for most musicians who aren't that good at that because they're musicians and that's a different thing, and you have to go away for 2 years and work on a new album, when you come back, if you're relying on every one of your listeners remembering you, you're in trouble because it's been 2 years, they've been listening to other things, they've forgotten that they didn't stop loving you, but they had to move on with their lives. But if there's a community that you're part of, someone in that community will remember and will go on the message board for that community or that style, whatever it is, and go, hey, you remember, what's his name? He's got a new album. And then the rest of the people will go, oh yeah, I do remember that guy. That last album was great. I'll listen to this new album. That's what you need. You, as an artist who doesn't have a fan base that's already attached to them, you need some way for a community to remember you so that you can rejoin their world when you have something new to contribute.
So just to kind of conclude, we've been talking about Spotify as an audio company, as a music company, and music streaming. But in the last few years, particularly, first with podcasting, now with audiobooks, and with a kind of corresponding rise in from a low base, but still thinking about video more as a platform, Spotify increasingly feels like it considered itself. It was a music company. It's now an audio company. Watching that from the inside and observing it from the outside now, how do you think that has changed the company, and to what extent does it, from your perspective, misalign the incentives of artists and Spotify, or do you think that has it been neutral, or has there been an issue there?
I mean, the thing that misaligns the incentives of Spotify and artists is the stock market. And the fact that Spotify got into other businesses in part to be a more attractive investment target for certain kinds of investors, you could argue that makes the other businesses the enemy of music in some sense. As someone working there, I mean, I'm a music person, so all these other things just seem like a distraction to me. And I think
podcasts. Why would you?
I mean, I'm the sort of person who likes podcasts, but I don't actually listen to podcasts because it takes up my music listening time. I can't
get that up.
There's only so many years left in my life. I don't have the time. I'm sorry. The same with audiobooks. I love reading books while listening to music. Listening to a book while listening to music doesn't work. So it's not there for me. I did occasionally help out with algorithmic stuff for podcasts and a little bit for audiobooks, because the techniques, there's different dynamics, but the techniques are basically similar. But I just, it doesn't help the music world to have the front page split between music and podcasts. I don't think it helps anybody except investors somewhere. And so for me, who has definitely never been in charge of the profitability of any company, much less Spotify, I never wanted it. And I just dreamed that one day we'd get an email from Daniel Ek and said, you know what? I woke up and I just realized this is all a pointless distraction. I'm a Nirvana fan. Let's just be really good at music. I never got that email.
Well, this has been so fascinating. I genuinely could do like two more hours, but we have to let you go. But look, really appreciate you coming on the fold, sure, Glenn, and the book. Do you want to just plug it, because I genuinely think our audience would get a kick out of it? So
the book it's blue. It's called "You Have Not Yet Heard Your Favorite Song: How Streaming Changes Music," published by Canberra Press. You can get it online.
Maybe even an audiobook version on Spotify, if that's your bag.
There is not yet. But if there's demand, then I would be willing to read it into a microphone.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Glenn.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.